3 months after the coup, the United Nations says Myanmar is on the brink of collapse. Armed ethnic groups are now helping civilians form militias to fight the military as opposition to the junta's brutal crackdown intensifies. Has the time come for the international community to intervene? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the escalating conflict in Myanmar. Well, 3 months after General Min Aung Hlaing seized power and imposed military rule, the United Nations says Myanmar's economy is approaching total collapse. The military is increasing attacks on armed ethnic groups, and there are now reports that civilians, mostly students, are getting weapons and training from those same insurgents. Add that to the COVID-19 crisis, and the UN estimates half the country will be pushed into poverty by next year. And yet the UN Security Council has once again failed to agree on a common position, with Beijing, the junta's biggest supporter, and Russia in opposition to any decisive response. Last month's ASEAN summit has done little to change the situation on the ground as the numbers of people killed or imprisoned steadily rise. So, is Myanmar at risk of becoming a failed state? And is the absence of a collective international response hastening its descent into an even deadlier, drawn-out conflict? Here's Natalie Pohonen.
An anti-coup protest in Yangon, flash mob style. Demonstrators come together quickly, raise their voices and give the three-finger salute. Democracy! Democracy! Then within minutes, they disperse to avoid being detected by security forces. It's another incarnation of protest against the military junta that seized control in February, ousting the democratically elected government led by Aung San Suu Kyi. If the generals believed that with time the public would eventually comply, these past 3 months have shown them that Myanmar's people refuse to accept their rule. The crackdown on dissent has been brutal. The security forces have killed more than 760 protesters and bystanders, including children, according to a local monitoring group. Yet the protests go on. For many, that means going on strike as part of the civil disobedience movement. Medical workers, engineers, civil servants, and even students are all taking part. Everyday acts of defiance have come to define the public's response to having their elected government taken away in what had been a budding democracy. Members of the ousted civilian government and other groups opposed to the Tatmadaw have now formed a shadow government.
Support the government of national unity for the lives of the people of the future. Support the national unity government for the future of our children. Only the people decide. Only the people will take part in the final battle. I believe we will win. The uprising must succeed.
They've announced they're forming a People's Defence Force to protect supporters from junta violence. Some protesters have also started taking defence into their own hands. This video, obtained by Reuters in April, shows about 120 young people, most of them students, who say they're training as part of a new fighting force to resist the military. The unrest in Myanmar has also reignited fighting between ethnic militias and the Tatmadaw. Rebel fighters from the Karen National Union captured this military base near the border with Thailand. The military responded hours later with airstrikes on villages controlled by the rebels. And in Kachin State in the north, the Kachin Independence Army claimed responsibility for downing this military helicopter. It's clear the scope and scale of the unrest is expanding, and that makes the prospects of a peaceful solution appear ever more distant. International condemnation of the junta and the imposition of sanctions against military leaders doesn't seem to have affected their approach. They say the violence will only stop when the country returns to stability. For now, that means retaining their grip on power and leaving Myanmar's people in an increasingly precarious position. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Let's get straight to our panel. And joining me from Geneva is Hnin Thon. She is an officer at Burma Campaign UK and also the daughter of detained activist Mia Ai. Also with us is Khin Ohmar. She is the chair of the Progressive Voices Advisory Board. And in London, visiting scholar at Queen Mary University of London's International State Crime Initiative, Ronan Lee. Thanks all so much for being with us. Hnin, I'll start with you because a few months ago, we discussed the prospect of seeing protesters take up arms in order to fight the military. You felt at the time that was not the way to resolve things, but effectively that's actually what we're seeing now, or starting to see now. Are you surprised, and where could this lead?
If we have to say about conflicts in Burma, it's nothing new because conflicts been going on in Burma for more than 7 decades, and some ethnic people started taking up arms as early as independence. This is a small number of young people going to join the ethnic armed organizations to fight against the military. And even when we were seeing reforms in the last 10 years, conflicts in ethnic areas were increasing. People were continuing to be killed and still being killed by the military. And, this is a small number of people. And if you look at the city area and other parts of the country, there are still peaceful protests going on. People are still risking their lives, going out on the street, protesting, knowing that they will be arrested and they will be killed. The international response against the military coup and the Myanmar line has been really disappointing. Rather than taking actually effective action, they are debating about whether Burma is becoming a failed state or Burma is going to descend into civil wars. There are so many effective actions that they can be taking. They are not. They are, condemning the military coup, and it hasn't stopped the violence against the peaceful protesters. And we are over 3 months of living in this fear now.
Right. Khin Ohmar, you had also hoped at the time that it wouldn't come to seeing civilians start to arm themselves. But it seems some of them, even if it's just in the small numbers that Hnin was saying, are finding a way to do that. Are you scared, though, that this could indeed spiral out of control because of, in large part, the lack of foreign intervention right now? Khin Ohmar, if you can hear me, do go ahead.
Hi. Yes. Could you repeat it again, please? I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, do you fear that this could actually spiral further out of control now that some civilians, even if they are in the small numbers that Hnin was saying, are starting to take up arms and we're seeing more of a militarization of this conflict?
I wouldn't call it as a militarization of the conflict because it is actually the military that has already militarized the whole country. They are the one terrorizing the country across the, the people across the country. So, I mean, like I said in the last time also, like people are left with no option to defend for their life and to defend for what they believe in democracy because nobody is helping them. So under the circumstances, you are seeing these young people taking up armed struggle. Like at the same time, the newly established the National Unity Government, which is a legitimate government of the people of Burma, the people of Myanmar, they have also just formed this People Defense Force to protect the people. So I wouldn't call it as they are the one militarizing the country. It is actually the military who is terrorizing the country.
Yeah, further militarizing.
Self-defense.
Yeah.
Self-defense, I would say.
Okay, fair enough. Ronan Lee, I mean, we've heard now kind of assessments of what's actually happening right now, but I want you to look forward and tell us where you do see this going.
Well, it's a catastrophe. We've got a situation where the people of Myanmar quite clearly do not want the military in control of their country. It's been 3 months since the coup was instigated by the military. They jailed the democratically elected government that was elected just last November. During those 3 months, there's been a very strong civil disobedience movement. The banking sector is close to collapse. The economy is close to collapse. And these are indications that this is what military rule brings to Myanmar. And that's why the people don't want them. And what it means going forward is that it's unlikely that the people are going to give up any day soon. Now, the military's tactic to try and convince people in Myanmar that their rule is in some way legitimate is to shoot at them and to use violence and repression, and that's not working anymore. what the people of Myanmar see is that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rid their country of military rule. And they're not going to give up any day soon.
Okay. The fear, though, now, Ronan, I'll stick with you for 1 second. The fear now is that, as the UN has actually indicated, Myanmar is heading toward becoming a failed state. If that is the case, are we looking at the disintegration of the country?
Myanmar is well on the way to becoming a failed state. I mean, the economy is on the brink of collapse, if it hasn't already collapsed. Imports have virtually ground to a halt. The banking sector isn't functioning. Small business, it just can't work. People aren't able to plant crops because they're protesting the military, or they fear being murdered by the military if they appear on the streets. This is deeply concerning for the international community because this is a strategically important place. It shares a very long land border with China. It shares a border with India and with Thailand. It's on the Bay of Bengal. A failed state in the heart of Southeast Asia is in no one's interests. But surprisingly, I think, is China's reluctance to take strong action at the United Nations Security Council. China seems to believe that it's possible for Myanmar to revert to the pre-coup status quo, where the military would retain significant influence in the politics of the country and the economics of the country. But that opportunity has passed. I mean, maybe that was the case during the first 2, 3 or 4 weeks after the coup, but I don't think that's possible anymore. And what that means is that China's reluctance to allow the UN Security Council to take stronger action means that China's going to have to take responsibility for the broader consequences of allowing the situation in Myanmar to spiral out of control. And it's looking desperately, desperately sad.
Okay. Hnin, if the anti-coup movement, doesn't fight fire with fire, what can be done to stop the military from cracking down further and locking in this oppression?
Violence is the main thing that military know, and they know that very well, and they keep using against peaceful protesters and other activists for more than 3 months now. They thought that if they use violence, it would stop people from coming out on the street and protesting, but they have been wrong terribly. And we are seeing more protests every day. They're more creative in their protests. Despite some shortcomings, civil disobedience movement in the country is still going strong. So people in Burma, they know that there are a lot of dire consequences if they go out on the street, not only risking their lives, but also financially by taking part in CDM. But they are also asking for international community to help. But really sad thing is that the UN Security Council has failed to do their job. And they failed to protect the people inside the country. And, you can put out statements after statements, but it hasn't got any effect on the Burmese military generals. And they know, and they have a sense of impunity because no proper action has been taken against them, even with the Rohingya genocide in 2017. So human rights organizations across the world are calling for different action, and they need to take them.
Right. Khin Ohmar, you specifically appealed to the United States to intervene. But as far as solutions are concerned, what do you think could be offered as an incentive to the generals to get them to stand down? Could they be offered some sort of safe haven, perhaps? Or could they be offered amnesty in order to stay in Myanmar but step aside? What do you see as an actual solution to get the generals to give in to public demands eventually?
I think it's very clear for the way that I see is for the generals to give in, we need more punitive actions, punitive measures, because that's the only way that they will respond and they will speak and they will come to negotiate with the government and the people. So that's the very reason that we are actually encouraged to see the United States government as well as the UK and the EU taking the very good steps by imposing sanctions on the military conglomerates, because these military conglomerates, they are the one getting the money to actually fund those atrocity crimes. So they need to be actually the financial flow must be cut. So that's the only way Yes.
Right. I'm sure you all agree on that you want to see punitive action taken against the generals now. But Ronan, let me put to you, punitive action leading to what? If we fast forward this process and the generals eventually do realize that this is unsustainable, what can be offered to them to finalize their brutal rule, to either get them out of the country or force them to step aside and perhaps even stay in Myanmar? I'm not sure how that will work, but what do you envision?
Well, I think the first step has to be that they have to become convinced that they need to step aside, and they're not at that stage yet. They're far from it. They're maintaining that they're the legitimate government of Myanmar, which they're not. They're frankly hated by the people of Myanmar. But the international community has a role here. The international community needs to stop treating the military as though it is in any way a legitimate government of Myanmar. That's going to have to be the first step. I mean, we're a long way away from getting justice for the crimes committed by Myanmar's military. They got away with genocidally mistreating the Rohingya with very, well, frankly, no international sanction. So, of course, they think they can get away with the coup. The first step has to be recognition of the alternative government of Myanmar, the National Unity Government, and that will make clear to the generals that they're losing any international recognition. The community needs to stop negotiating with the generals as though they're a legitimate government, and they also need to make sure that they stop selling the military weapons.
Right.
As of today, the Myanmar military can still buy guns and bombs and bullets that they're using against civilians and using against children.
You know, Ronan, Myanmar has dealt with ethnic separatists, armed independence groups, and now with this threat of all of Myanmar just becoming a failed state. All of it could blow up and become entirely destabilized. And if that becomes the case, how much will the international community, you alluded to this earlier, but I mean, tell us sincerely how much they will regret not coming to the assistance of the democratically elected government and the people that are protesting now, trying to save their democracy?
Well, they'll certainly regret it deeply if Myanmar becomes a failed state that borders China, India, and Thailand. I mean, that is deeply worrying for the stability of the region. The military of Myanmar has had no problems in the past forcibly deporting hundreds of thousands of people across international frontiers. China potentially faces that being done along their frontier. They've got a 2,000-kilometre land border with Myanmar. Thailand's experienced it in the past, most recently Bangladesh. It could be incredibly destabilising. And I think at that point, members of the international community will desperately regret not having taken action when action could have been taken to avoid the catastrophe that the country now faces. The reality here is that the military's legitimacy doesn't exist in Myanmar. The people don't want them, and the people aren't prepared to work for them. So the only legitimate government that Myanmar can have moving forward is one that maintains the support of the civilian population of Myanmar and respects the democratic aspirations of the people of Myanmar. And at the moment, that is certainly the National Unity Government, not the military.
Okay.
And by allowing this to spiral, I think we have a very bad situation ahead of us.
Ronan Lee, I'm going to have to allow that to be the last word for this segment because we're completely out of time. But I'd like to thank all three of you so much for being with us on the Newsmakers. Now to the Channel Islands, where British warships are monitoring a flotilla of French fishing boats in Jersey Harbor following a dispute over fishing rights. France's Navy has dispatched 2 of its own patrols to monitor that protest that started after France accused the UK of breaking a deal that granted them full access to UK fishing waters post-Brexit. France is threatening to cut Jersey's power supply in addition to blocking its ports. Well, to talk about where this dispute might be going is Scott Edwards. He's a researcher at the University of Bristol and a research associate at Safe Seas, a network that investigates maritime security. Scott, thanks so much for being with us. Okay, these are UK islands, but they are geographically much closer to France, which is where they get their power supply from. the trade deal that led to the standoff was negotiated very quickly without a lot of attention to the day-to-day details. And voila, here we are. So who's right and who's wrong here?
That's a very difficult question to start with. But yeah, I don't think there's necessarily a case of right and wrong here, but I think it shows the kind of problems behind the process generally, right? So you have this kind of situation of Brexit, obviously, where we've had to renegotiate the way that we deal with our fisheries and the way that we manage our waters. And we've had to renegotiate this with the European Union. Jersey is an interesting case because Jersey is actually, it wasn't part of the European Union's common fisheries policy. And there were separate kind of agreements in place. But because of this negotiation process and because of the new requirements, it's kind of brought these tensions to a fold. So I wouldn't necessarily say anyone's right or wrong, but I do think this process has been problematic. And I think what this shows in particular is there hasn't been enough communication necessarily between the British and our counterparts in the European Union, because France's claims are essentially that they weren't aware of these new requirements, they weren't aware of these measures, and therefore they didn't have time to prepare for them. So there is perhaps a blame game played there. But
the provisions really, I mean, the UK has implemented this pretty onerous demand that French fishermen prove via GPS records that they were fishing in these waters between 2012 and 2016 in order to get a license today. How's that really practically supposed to work?
Yeah, I think on the terms of the practical levels, it's not in itself extremely difficult. I mean, we do track most of our fishing vessels. We have AIS now, the automatic identification. We have GPS and things like this. These are all used to manage fisheries day to day across the world. But I think the problem here is you kind of have these long-lasting sensitivities. You have the kind of problems around the process as well. So it's kind of it's something that's easy to ignite. It's not necessarily that this would be a problem everywhere, but because there's already been sensitivity within this area, and there have been tensions in the past surrounding these waters, that you kind of have this easy, this kind of easy foundation for conflict to emerge. But I think the technical side of things, I'd say that onerous, to be honest.
I mean, how symbolic is this of the kind of unforeseen difficulties in Brexit, or the challenges that were underestimated? Let's put it that way. How symbolic is this standoff right now of a much wider problem in Brexit?
Yeah, I think this is extremely symbolic of these kind of wider issues. I mean, here you have, like you mentioned earlier, you have a rushed negotiation, you have a rushed trade deal surrounding like a very sensitive area, and therefore coming together to a kind of difficult compromise that no one's happy with. There's still a lack of clarity on what's going to happen in the future, right? We have this 5-year phased implementation, and then after that, there's this kind of potential for ongoing negotiations about access and things like this. So this is clearly an unfinished process, and it's clearly something that we've been unprepared for on a more general level. And I think the UK it's starting to realise that Brexit in particular highlights that there's a lot of kind of complexity around UK maritime security, a lot of complexity around fishery management and things like this. And previously, I guess we've always almost taken it for granted that we've had these kind of structures where it's been managed in a shared manner. But then this is kind of changing because of Brexit, and we're still coming to grips with how to go about this in future and what kind of structures there should be to replace.
Just quickly, though, on this specific issue, what we're seeing right now, if I'm reading you right, you're not particularly concerned that this will escalate any further in spite of threats to cut power to the island and warships being sent by the British to watch the flotilla, correct?
Yeah, I'm not concerned myself. I think the deployment of the British Navy, I mean, it can be seen as problematic. It can be interpreted as being quite a strong symbol and quite a strong move, right? But the two vessels, the overseas protection vessels that have been sent there, their role is fishery protection. So traditionally these vessels, they protect Britain's fisheries.
Okay.
They're trained to inspect fishing vessels. That they have a role in kind of fishery inspection and things like that.
Just
So
quickly,
it's not
So I've only got a minute left, and I just need you to explain quickly, because this is a huge matter here. The issue of fishing rights anyways, it means relatively little to the overall economy, but politically it is so big. Why?
I think in terms of this sense, I mean, there's this idea, right, there's Britain's waters. So with the whole Brexit narrative of taking back control for Britain. And I think the seas became a very strong symbol of that, with Britain being an island in particular. So you have this kind of very strong politicization. As you say, the economic dimensions aren't particularly, they're not massive. In the Jersey case, I think they only have like 75 registered fishing vessels in Jersey anyway that kind of fish in these waters. So whilst people independently are kind of reliant on this for their income, in terms of the overall economy, it doesn't actually contribute such a strong amount. But as you mentioned, that the whole politicization during Brexit means that it's very sensitive, and there's a lot of kind of legitimacy of the government tied up in this now.
Scott Edwards, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. We appreciate it. And thanks, of course, to our viewers for joining us as well. We'll see you next time.